The wind came down off the high peaks like something alive, and the woman did not flinch. She knelt in the loose rock, her bare hands wrapped in strips of torn cloth, and she lifted a stone the weight of a small child. Her arms shook. She carried it up the slope anyway. One step, then another. Behind her, the whole valley was already turning white. Down in the town, they had a name for her now. The Mad Widow on the Ridge. They watched the thin thread of smoke climb from the mountain, and they laughed, the way frightened people laugh at things they cannot understand. They had given her 14 days to leave her home. She had taken those days and climbed higher than any of them dared to go. 6 weeks before, she had buried her husband. Then a stranger had handed her a slip of paper that measured a man's whole life in a single small number. And there, alone, with winter bearing down like a closing door, she had decided something the world had never given her permission to decide. She had decided to live. The first snow touched her shoulders. She set the stone in place, and she reached for the next. The town sat high in the mountains, where the air was thin and the winters came early. It was the kind of place built by men who wanted what was buried in the rock and forgotten by everyone else. The houses leaned close together along a single dirt road. Smoke rose from crooked chimneys, and above it all, the peaks stood white and silent, watching the small lives below like something patient and old. On the far edge of that road stood a small house, number 11, plain, weathered. A house like all the others, except for the woman inside it. Her name was Marin. She was 38 years old, though grief had a way of making a face look older than its years. Her hands were strong. Her eyes were steady. And on that particular afternoon, those eyes were fixed on the road, watching a young man walk toward her door as if his boots were filled with stones. She already knew. A woman who has lost everything learns to read the shape of bad news from a long way off. The young man's name was Pruitt. He was thin, with a soft chin and a suit a size too small in the shoulders. He worked as a clerk for the company that owned the mine that owned the town that had owned her husband. He climbed the 3 steps to her porch. He would not look at her. In his hand, he held an envelope. He held it the way a person holds something already dead. "Mrs. Marin," he said. His voice came out thin in the cold. "This is a formal notice from the company." She did not reach for it. She stood in the doorway and looked past him, past his shoulder, to the high passes already dusted with the first snow of the season. Winter was not coming. Winter was already there, waiting in the high country, gathering itself. 6 weeks. That was how long her husband had been in the ground. Ezra, a good man, a quiet man, a man who had gone down into the dark of the earth one ordinary morning and never come back up. The rock had taken him. A shaft, 1,000 feet below the very porch she now stood on, had folded in on itself, and folded him with it. 6 weeks she had carried that, and now this. She took the envelope at last. Her hands did not shake. The paper inside was thick and important feeling, the way cruel things often are. It was typed in clean, even letters, as though a machine could make the words hurt less. Her right to live in the house was ended. The usual grace was 30 days. But the company needed the rooms for new men coming in before the passes closed for the winter. So her time had been shortened. 14 days. 14 days to be gone. And below that, a second paragraph. A final settlement for the death of her husband. $75. It was not offered as an apology. It was not offered as sorrow. It was offered as a closing of the books. A tidy little number to make a man disappear. $75. For a life. The clerk cleared his throat. "There's a check waiting at the office," he said. "You just need to sign a waiver. That's all." Maren folded the paper, slowly, carefully. She slipped it into the pocket of her apron. Then she looked at him, and it was the look that undid him. She did not weep. She did not raise her voice. She did not curse the company or the cold or the God who had let the rock fall. She simply looked at him, directly, the way a person looks at a column of numbers that does not add up. 14 days, she said. It was not a question. "Yes, ma'am," the young man whispered, "and $75. "Yes, ma'am." He shifted his weight. He had delivered bad news before. He knew the shape of grief, the shouting, the tears, the begging. He knew how to stand inside those storms and wait for them to pass. But this stillness, he did not know what to do with this. Her calm frightened him more than any scream could have. "I'm sorry," he said, and the strange thing was, he meant it. But the words had no weight. He was only the hand that carried the message. The cruelty had been written somewhere far away, in some warm office, by men who had never once felt the bite of a mountain winter. He mumbled something about his duties. Then he turned and walked quickly down the path, his boots crunching on the frost-hard ground. Fleeing, though he would never have called it that. Maren watched him go. She watched until he was nothing but a small dark shape against the white road. Then she stepped back inside and closed the door softly behind her. The house was full of him, of Ezra, the smell of sawdust and pipe smoke. The faint metal tang of the earth he had worked in soaked into the very walls. The chair by the window he had built with his own hands, the shelf, the table, all of it. Him. In 14 days, this too would be taken. She crossed to the kitchen table and sat down in his chair. She laid the notice flat on the worn pine and smoothed it with her palm. And then she read it again. Not for the pain of it. She had already taken the pain. She read it for the facts. 14 days. $75. Leave. Simple words. Final words. This was the moment, she understood, when one life ended and another would have to begin. Whatever that new life was. Whatever it cost. She sat very still as the afternoon light slid across the floor, pale and thin, growing weaker by the minute. A small preview of the long darkness coming for the whole valley. She did not light the lamp. She let the dark come. And in that darkening kitchen, alone, she began the cold arithmetic of staying alive. The $75 was a beginning. She would not pretend otherwise. Pride was a thing she could not afford to feed. But she had her own money, too. In a small tin box, hidden beneath a loose board in the bedroom floor, she had saved for years. Coins earned from selling eggs, from mending the torn shirts of miners who had no wives to mend for them. Quiet money, patient money. She rose in the dark and went to get it. She counted it out on the table by the faint blue light of the moon coming through the window. $42 $117. Together with the company's $117.16. She looked at the small pile of coins and paper on the table. It felt like a fortune. It felt like nothing at all. Her mind began to work, and it worked the way it always had, like a careful bookkeeper laying out every option in a quiet, private accounting. The first option was to leave the mountains, to take the long stage down to the city, but the ticket alone would cost her a good piece of what she had, and once she arrived, a room would cost more each week than she dared to think about. And work? Work was a question with no good answer. She was 38. The kitchens, the laundries, the boarding houses. They wanted young women. Girls with strong backs who could work 14 hours and never complain. They did not want a widow nearing 40, with grief already written into the lines of her face. She did the figures in her head. 10 weeks, maybe. 12 if she ate almost nothing. 12 weeks would carry her to the very heart of winter, and then leave her with empty hands in a city full of strangers. She drew a line through that option in her mind. It was only a slower way to die. The second option was to stay. But there was no staying. The town was not a town. Not really. It was the company's camp wearing a town's clothes. Every house, every store, every inch of dirt belonged to the men who owned the mine. There was no room to rent that they did not own. There was no work for a woman like her. None but the saloon, and she was not made for that. And they would not have had her anyway. She had no family. Her parents were long gone. Ezra had been an orphan. The two of them had been a whole world unto themselves, a small, sturdy world of two. And now the world was one, and one was not enough to live on. She sat in the dark and stared at the truth of it. $117. 14 days until she had no roof. Winter coming down like an army. And she was nothing more than a small number on a company's page. A cost. A thing to be cleared away before it became a bother. It came to her then, sitting in the cold, that the falling rock had not truly killed her husband. The same cold logic had killed him. A logic that valued the ore in the ground more than the man who dug it out. She felt no pity for herself. Pity was a heavy, useless thing, and she had no room to carry it. Pity would not keep her warm. Pity would not fill her belly through a mountain winter. What she needed was an answer. She was a problem to be solved. And the materials she had to solve it with were these: one woman, $117, and a wilderness that did not care whether she lived or died. It was a terrifying thing to see so clearly, but there was a strange comfort in it too. She knew exactly where she stood. She stood at the edge of a cliff, and the only direction left was forward. She rose from the chair. Her body was stiff with sitting and sorrow, but her hands were sure. It was time to begin. If she had only 14 days, she would not waste a single one of them. She would start with him, with Ezra's things. The trunk sat at the foot of the bed, where it had sat untouched for 6 weeks. She knelt before it in the moonlight and lifted the lid. His scent rose up to meet her. For a long moment she could not move. His spare wool shirts, folded the way he folded them. A worn book he had loved, its spine soft from his hands. And beneath them all, at the very bottom, something she had never seen before. A journal, bound in dark brown leather, the corners worn smooth. She lifted it out as if it might break. She had thought she knew everything about her husband, the way a wife thinks she knows a man after years of sharing his bread and his bed and his silences. But here was a piece of him she had never held. She sat down on the cold floor and opened it. And there, page after page, was his hand, his neat, careful, precise writing. But it was not a diary of feelings. Ezra had never been a man for feelings on paper. It was something else. It was a record of the earth. She had known he was a miner. She had not fully known the other thing, that in his few free hours he had been a student of the mountains, self-taught, patient, walking the high country not for pleasure alone, but for understanding. He saw the world in layers, in stone and water and slope. He had written it all down, the way one rock lay against another, the way water moved beneath the surface, the way the trees grew thick on one side of a hill and thin on the other. She turned the pages slowly, by candlelight now, for she had finally lit a candle, unable to bear the dark with his voice rising up from the paper. His sketches, his small, careful drawings of stone and ridge. It was like a conversation across a great distance, across the distance between the living and the dead. And then she found it. An entry near the back, dated by season, not by any year she would speak aloud, written in his steady hand. The heading read, "A limestone alcove, south slope of the unnamed ridge," and below the heading, in lighter ink, as if added later, almost shy, he had written two more words, "Widow's Ridge." She did not understand then why those words made her breath catch. She read on. He had written it the way he wrote everything, plainly, precisely, with the quiet certainty of a man describing the truth. He had found, he wrote, a remarkable thing while walking an old abandoned claim, a natural alcove, a shallow cave set deep into a great wall of pale limestone, 20 feet across at the mouth, 12 feet deep, the ceiling tall at the front, sloping gently to the back. And most important of all, it faced due south, a perfect collector of the winter sun. The floor sloped gently outward, so the water would drain. A small, steady spring rose from the rock not far to the west, and the stone itself, the limestone, held heat like nothing he had ever felt. Even long after the sun went down, he wrote, the rock gave its warmth back into the air. With a wall of dry stacked stone built across the front, a doorway, a small window. It would be more than a shelter. It would be almost a house. Below the words, he had drawn it. The curve of the alcove, the slope of the hill, the little spring. He had even sketched the wall he imagined, had marked where a door might go, where a window might let in the light. He had drawn the direction of the cruel northwest wind, and shown how the great body of the ridge would break it, would turn it, would keep it out. And then, at the very bottom of the entry, he had written one last line, a simple statement of fact, the way he stated all things. A person could survive a hard winter there, with proper care. A person could survive it in comfort. Marin closed the journal. She held it against her chest with both arms, the way a mother holds a child. And in that small, candlelit room, something cracked open inside her. Not grief, not fear. Something warmer, something fragile. Something she had not felt in 6 long weeks. Because she understood now what she was holding. This was her inheritance. Not money, not property, not the $75 they had measured his life with. Something far greater. Knowledge, a place, a way through. It was as if her husband had reached his hand across the dark river between them and pressed a key into her palm. He had seen this place, long before he died, long before he could have known what was coming for her, and he had written it all down with the same care he gave to everything he loved. He had, without ever knowing it, prepared a way for her to live. For 6 weeks, she had felt utterly, completely alone. A widow. Discarded. A name that no longer mattered to anyone. But now, holding this book in the candlelight, she understood something the company could never take from her. She was not alone. Ezra was still with her. His mind was a map she could follow. His voice was a quiet instruction in her ear. "Thank you," she whispered into the still air, and the candle flame did not move. She slept little that night, and what sleep she found was thin. But for the first time in 6 weeks, it was not a sleep of despair. It was the restless sleep of a person who has finally been given something to do. She rose before the dawn. She dressed in her sturdiest boots, a heavy wool skirt, and his coat, Ezra's coat, which hung loose on her shoulders but wrapped her in the familiar weight of him. She packed a small canvas bag, a heel of bread, a wedge of cheese, a canteen of water, and the journal. Always the journal. She slipped out of the silent house as the first gray light touched the highest peaks. Her breath rose in white clouds before her face. The whole town slept, indifferent, and she was glad of it. The directions were there in his hand. Follow the creek north. Then take the old logging trail where it branches to the east. Climb. Keep climbing. So she climbed. The trail was barely a trail at all anymore. Time had nearly swallowed it. Fallen timber blocked her way. Thickets of mountain laurel reached out to catch at the wool of her coat. She pushed through, branch by branch. The air grew thinner the higher she went. Her lungs began to burn. Her legs ached with the effort. But the work was a mercy. It pushed the grief to the edges of her mind. It pushed back the fear. It left room for nothing but the next step, and the next, and the next. She stopped now and then to read his pages, to match his small drawings against the land around her. A granite outcrop shaped like the head of a bear. A stand of ancient, twisted pines, bent by 100 winters of wind. He had marked them all. She was walking, quite literally, in her husband's footsteps. There came a moment, perhaps 2 hours in, when she nearly turned back. The slope had grown brutal. Her hands were scraped from the rock. Her chest heaved. The doubt crept in the way doubt always does, cold and reasonable. What if the place was not as he had written it? What if it was wet, or too small, or faced the wrong way? What if she had climbed all this way? Toward nothing. She stood there on the steep slope, swaying, the doubt pulling at her like a current. And then she opened the journal one more time. She looked at his hand, his careful, certain hand, and she heard him. Not truly, not a ghost, but the memory of him, which is its own kind of presence. Keep climbing, the memory said. So she did. The trees began to thin. The ground opened into a slope of loose stone and pale sun-bleached grass. And then she stepped out, and the whole world fell away beneath her. The valleys spread below her, vast and breathtaking. The town a tiny gray smudge, impossibly small from up here. The company that had thrown her away, reduced to nothing. A speck, a thing she could have covered with her thumb. And there, just as he had promised, the great pale wall of limestone, rising from the mountainside, tall, solid, glowing faintly silver in the early sun. Her heart began to pound, and not from the climb. She followed the base of the cliff, her breath catching with hope and dread all at once. It was hidden, just as he had said it would be, tucked behind a screen of gnarled old juniper so that a person could pass within 50 feet and never know it was there. She pushed aside a heavy branch, and she stopped. Her hand went to her mouth. It was perfect. It was exactly as he had drawn it. The mouth of the alcove curved in a wide, graceful arch in the rock, 20 feet across, just as he had written. The floor was covered in fine, dry dust. The stone walls rose smooth and solid around her. She stepped inside. Her footsteps made no sound, and the moment she crossed beneath the arch, she felt it. The air was still and warmer, noticeably warmer than the cold morning outside. The stone was holding the warmth, just as he had said. She looked up. The ceiling was tall at the entrance, sloping gently to the back, where she could see a dark line in the rock, a natural crack rising upward, a chimney ready-made by the patient hand of the mountain. She walked the space slowly, the way he would have, taking the measure of it. 200 square feet, near enough. The size of a small cabin. The floor dry and sloped just right. The whole of it facing south, open to the winter sun from morning until late in the day. She stepped back outside and found the spring, a thin, clear thread of water seeping from the rock, gathering in a small stone basin worn smooth by time. And below the ridge, the south-facing slope was scattered with fallen timber, dry, seasoned, years of it. Enough wood to burn through a dozen winters. And everywhere, flat slabs of stone, fallen from the cliffs above, as if the mountain itself had quarried them and laid them out, waiting, stone for building. Marin sat down on a flat rock at the mouth of the alcove. She took out the bread and the cheese, and she ate slowly, looking out at the world spread far below her. Up here, she was above it all, above the town, above the company, above the men who had decided she was worth a number on a page. From up here, all their power was small. Here there was only stone, and sun, and water, and wood. The 4 simple things a person needs to live. Her husband had not merely found a hiding place. He had found a fortress, a piece of the earth shaped, almost as if on purpose, for the keeping of a life. She opened the journal to his sketch one last time. She laid her bare hand flat against the page, over the lines his hand had made. "Thank you, Ezra," she whispered again. "I see it now." The wind moved softly through the juniper, and it might have been the wind, or it might have been something else. But for one moment, she felt warmer than the morning had any right to make her. She closed the book, and she made her decision. Not in grief, not in fear, but in something close to certainty. She would not get on the stage. She would not crawl down to the city to die slowly among strangers. She would not sign their waiver and disappear quietly. She would stay. She would take this stone and this sun and this wood and the knowledge her husband had left her and she would build a place no company could take from her. She would climb back down to that town one more time, and then she would climb back up, and she would not be climbing as a widow being thrown away. She would be climbing home. She stood at the mouth of the alcove a moment longer, a small figure against the great pale stone, the whole white valley falling away beneath her. 14 days, $117, and winter coming down the mountain like a closing door. But for the first time since the rock had taken her husband, Maren was not afraid. She turned and began the long walk down. There was work to be done. The store sat at the heart of the little town, where the single road widened just enough to let 2 wagons pass. It smelled of coffee and leather and dust and old wood, the way such places always do. The man behind the counter was old, past 70, with a fringe of white hair and hands that had gone knotted and stiff with the years, but his eyes had missed nothing in all that time, and they did not miss her now. His name was Amos Crane. He had known Ezra, had respected him in the quiet way that careful men respect one another, had watched him pay every debt the day it came due, and never once make a promise he could not keep. When the bell above the door rang and Maren walked in, Amos Crane set down what he was holding. "Mrs. Maren," he said. His voice was low, like stones turning over in a riverbed. "I heard about the notice." Word traveled fast in a town that small. There were no secrets in it, only things not yet spoken aloud. 14 days, she said simply. The old man looked at her for a long moment. "It's a hard thing," he said, "and a wrong one," and she knew, from the way he said it, that he meant every word. He looked down at the scrap of paper in her hand, a list written in a small, neat hand. "Now," he said, "what can I get you?" She began to read, and as she read, a slow understanding came over the old man's face. This was not the list of a woman packing to leave. A woman leaving bought a stage ticket and a meal for the road. A woman leaving did not buy this. "A shovel," she said. "A good one. The one in the barrel there." He pulled it out, set it on the counter. "A pickaxe," she went on. "The one with the hickory handle. It'll last." He set it beside the shovel. "A handsaw, a heavy hammer, and a level." He laid them down one by one, and he did not speak, because he was beginning to understand. This was the list of a woman arming herself for a war against the cold, a war against the mountain, a war against the men who had decided she was finished. She moved on to the provisions, and her voice never wavered. Flour by the hundredweight, beans dried by the sack, salt pork, salt, coffee, because even a soldier needs one small comfort to fight for. He weighed it all out, slow, careful, the way a man works when his hands have something to do, but his mind is somewhere else. He was watching a thing he had never seen before. "And matches," she said. 2 boxes, the large ones, and candles, and soap. Then she turned and pointed to the far corner of the store, to the largest thing he sold, a small, squat, black iron stove, pot-bellied, heavy as sin. "That," she said. "How much?" he told her. "I'll take it," she said. "And the pipe to go with it. As much as I'll need to run it up and out through a wall." The old man rubbed the back of his neck. He did not ask where the wall was. He did not ask what she was building, or why, or how a woman alone meant to do any of it before the snow came down for good. He only saw the set of her jaw, and he had lived long enough to know that some questions are better left unasked. Her last purchase was the largest piece of canvas he had. Heavy, treated, the kind that would shed water and break the wind. When she was finished, he added it all up. It came to more than half of everything she had in the world. She counted out the money on the worn wood of the counter, coin by coin, her hands precise, her face still. And as she counted, the old man went into the back room. She heard him moving about, drawers opening, something heavy being lifted. When he came back, he was carrying 3 things: a thick gray wool blanket, a small whetstone for keeping an edge on a saw and an axe, and a wooden box full of an honest jumble of nails and screws and iron hinges. He set them down beside her other things. Maren looked at them. "What do I owe you for these?" she asked. Amos Crane held her gaze. "Nothing," he said. She started to protest. He raised one stiff old hand, gently, and she stopped. "Ezra was a good man," he said. "He always settled what he owed. Every penny, every time." He nudged the box of nails an inch closer to her. "So this one's settled too. On the house." And there, in that dusty store that smelled of coffee and leather, something rose up in her throat that she had not felt since the notice came. Tears. The first since they had handed her a slip of paper and a number for her husband's life. It was not the cruelty that broke her. She had armored herself against cruelty. It was the kindness, the plain, unexpected, unasked for kindness of one old man. She blinked the tears back before they could fall. "Thank you, Amos," she said quietly. He nodded once, as if that were the end of it. Then his eyes went to the stove, to the heavy sacks, to all of it piled on his counter and his floor. "You'll never carry all this yourself," he said. It was not quite a question. "I'll come for it in pieces," she said. "I can manage the rest." He looked at her a long moment. "My boy can run the wagon up the old trail," he said. "Far as the wheels will go, for the heavy things, the stove." She started to say she could pay. $1, he said before she could. "That's the price. Not a penny off, not a penny more. So we both keep our pride." And at that, the smallest curve touched the corner of her mouth. It was not quite a smile, but in 14 days of hard gray facts, it was the closest thing. $1 then, she said. He would hold her goods for her, he told her, as long as she needed. He asked nothing more. He simply stood behind his counter, an old man with knotted hands, and watched her go. A quiet witness to a thing he did not fully understand. And in a world that had stamped her worthless and filed her away, one witness was worth more than gold. Word, of course, got out. It always did. By the next morning, the town had a story to chew on. And they chewed on it the way small, frightened places always chew on the strange. The widow had not left. The widow had bought a stove and tools and a mountain of flour. And then she had loaded a sack onto her own back and walked north out of town, up toward the high country, alone. They watched her go from doorways and windows, and they talked. Some pitied her. Grief did strange things to people, they said. The poor woman had lost her mind along with her man. She'd be back down within the week, frost-bitten and humbled, begging for the stage fare she should have taken in the first place. Others were less kind. They laughed. A widow, hauling rock up a mountain, playing at being a miner, a builder, a man. The mad widow on the ridge, they began to call her. The words drifted up the trail behind her like smoke. She heard them. She was not deaf, but she had stopped, somewhere in that dark kitchen, caring what frightened people thought of a thing they could not understand. Let them laugh. Laughter did not have to climb the mountain. She did. It was on her third trip up the trail that the man found her. He was not from the town exactly. He worked for the company in the way that everyone there worked for the company. A foreman of some kind. Broad through the shoulders. A hard, flat face. He came up the trail behind her on a mule, and he did not get down from it when he spoke. "You're Ezra's widow," he said. She set down the sack of beans, straightened her back, looked up at him. "I am. You know this is company land," he said. He waved one thick hand at the slope, the trees, the high pale cliffs above. All of it. Up to the ridgeline and past it. "I know what the company claims," she said. Something flickered across his face. He had expected her to flinch. "Mr. Voss sent me to tell you," he said. "Whatever it is you think you're doing up here, you'd best stop. There's no living up this mountain. Not for a man. Surely not for a woman." She picked up the sack of beans again. She settled it onto her shoulder, slow and steady, the way she had learned to. "You can tell Mr. Voss," she said, "that the company gave me 14 days to be off their land." She started up the trail. "I intend to use every one of them." And she left him sitting on his mule, watching her climb. Conrad Voss was the man who ran the mine. He was not a cruel man, exactly. That was the worst of it. Cruelty, at least, takes notice of the person it hurts. Voss did not. To him, the men in the shafts were a cost, like timber and powder and lamp oil. The widows they left behind were a cost too. A smaller one, to be settled as cheaply and quickly as the rules allowed. He had signed her notice without ever once seeing her face. And when his foreman came back down the mountain and told him the widow had laughed off the warning, had only climbed higher with a sack on her back, Voss did not get angry. He merely shook his head, the way a man shakes his head at a fly he cannot be bothered to swat. "She'll freeze," he said, "or she'll quit. Either way, the problem solves itself." And he went back to his work. He had decided what she was worth. He had no idea what she was about to become. The labor began in earnest, and for the days that followed, her whole life narrowed down to one thing: effort. Pure, simple, body-breaking effort. She rose before the light each morning. She slept the moment the dark came down, and sometimes not even then, working by firelight until her eyes would no longer stay open. And in between, she worked until her hands shook and her legs gave out and her breath came in ragged clouds. The first task was moving her supplies. She could not carry the stove. Not yet. But she could carry the rest, 50 pounds at a time, lashed to her back, up the 4 long miles of trail. Each trip took her the better part of 3 hours, one way. Up before dawn, the sack on her back, the trail under her boots, one foot, then the other. The world reduced to the next 10 feet of ground. Her shoulders screamed. Her spine ached. Her lungs burned in the thin, high air. But a strange thing happened. With each trip, she grew stronger. The body, it turns out, is a stubborn and surprising thing. Push it, and it pushes back. Break it down, and it builds itself up harder than before. By the 4th day, the sacks felt lighter. By the 6th, she barely slowed at the steep places that had nearly broken her at the start. Her body was hardening to the work, the way the work was hardening her. She stored the provisions in the back of the alcove, deep in the cool, dry dark, covered with the heavy canvas to keep the damp away. And once the food was safe, she began the wall. This was the hardest of all of it. The slope below the ridge was scattered with flat slabs of granite, fallen from the cliffs across long years. The mountain had quarried them, but it had not carried them. That was her job. She took the pickaxe and worked each stone loose from the earth that had half swallowed it. Then she lifted it. Some of them light as a loaf of bread, some of them heavy as a sleeping child, and she carried it up the slope to the mouth of the alcove, one stone at a time. Her hands, soft from years of mending and washing and gentle work, did not last long. By the end of the first day, they were raw. By the third, they were a ruin, a patchwork of blisters and open cuts, the skin worn through at the base of every finger. She did not stop. She tore strips from an old worn shirt of Ezra's and wrapped her hands in them, and she went back to the stone. She was no mason. She had never laid a wall in her life. But Ezra had taught her, in the long evenings of their marriage, the way he taught her everything, without ever seeming to teach at all. Just talking, just thinking out loud about how the world held itself together. She heard his voice now, as she worked. "Choose the flat ones," he'd said once, turning a stone over in his hands by the fire. "A wall is only as good as the stones you say no to. Overlap the joints. Never let a crack run straight up. A straight crack is a place for the wall to come apart. Set every stone on 2 below it. 2 points hold, 1 point falls. And the little stones aren't nothing. The little stones are everything. They fill the gaps. They wedge the big ones tight. A wall without its small stones is just a pile waiting to happen." She had not known, when he said those things, that she was being given a gift. She knew it now. Stone by stone, the wall began to rise, a foot high, then 2. She left a gap for a door, 3 feet wide, a smaller gap for a window, then 3 feet. The gray granite climbing slowly across the mouth of the alcove like something growing out of the mountain itself. It was the hardest thing she had ever done, and it was the first thing in 6 weeks that felt like hope made solid. Then the mountain taught her a lesson. She had worked one whole long day on the western end of the wall, racing the failing light, her arms trembling with exhaustion. She had gotten careless. She had let a few stones sit on single points instead of 2. She had let a joint run a little too straight. She had been tired, and tired is when the mistakes get in. She woke in the gray before dawn to a sound, a low grinding, a shift, a soft, terrible rumble of stone giving way. She scrambled out of her bedroll just in time to see it. The western third of her wall. 3 days of brutal work, sliding, buckling, collapsing into a heap of loose granite at the mouth of the cave. She stood there in the cold half-light, breathing hard, and for one long, terrible moment, she felt the despair rise up to swallow her. All that work, those torn and bleeding hands, gone in a breath. The mountain mocking her right alongside the town. She could have wept. She could have sat down in the ruin of it and given up, and no one would have blamed her. No one would have even known. But then she heard him again. Not the soft, kind Ezra of the evenings by the fire. The other one, the one who studied the earth and refused to lie to himself about it. A wall that falls is teaching you something, the memory said. The only foolish thing is to build it back the same way. She walked into the heap of stone. She knelt, and she looked. She saw where she had let the joints run straight. She saw the stones she had set on single points. She saw, plain as daylight now, every place she had been lazy and tired and wrong. The mountain had not mocked her. The mountain had corrected her. She gathered the fallen stones, one by one, back down the slope, and she began again. Slower this time, more careful, refusing to let exhaustion make the choice for her. And this time, the wall held. Stone on two stones, joints overlapped, small stones wedged tight into every gap. When she set the last piece of that western end back in place, she pressed her bandaged hand flat against it, and she felt how solid it was, how it had become a part of the mountain rather than a thing leaning against it. She did not smile, but something in her chest sat a little straighter. The cold came down hard one night, harder than it had yet, and it brought the wolves. She had not finished the door. The opening still gaped, 3 feet of dark, between her and the night. She woke to the sound of them, not close at first. A long, rising call from somewhere down the slope. Then another, answering. Then a third, from a different direction entirely. She lay very still in her bedroll listening, her heart loud in her ears. They were circling. She had heard the men talk of the wolves in the high country, lean and hungry as the snow drove the game down, bold when they were hungry enough. And the winter had made them very hungry indeed. The calls drew closer. She reached slowly for the only weapons she had. The pickaxe, the hammer. She laid them within reach. Then she did the thing her husband's mind had taught her to do. She thought. She did not run, because there was nowhere to run. She did not freeze, because freezing was its own kind of death. She built up the fire. She had no stove yet, but she had a small ring of stones and a careful little blaze she kept for warmth and cooking. Now she fed it. Dry pine, then more. She built it up until the flames leapt and threw a wide, wavering circle of orange light across the mouth of the cave. Then she took a brand from the fire, a stout branch burning bright at one end, and she stood in the gap where her door would be, and she waited. She saw them at the edge of the firelight, eyes first, low to the ground, pairs of them, catching the flame and throwing it back, green gold and patient. Then the shapes behind the eyes, gray, lean, silent now. One came forward, bolder than the rest. It lowered its head, and a sound came out of it that was not quite a growl. Lower than that, older than that. Marin did not run. She stepped forward instead, into the gap, into the open, the burning brand held high over her head, the fire roaring at her back, her shadow thrown huge and wild across the snow. No, she said, just that. Her voice did not shake. Not here, not tonight, not me. And she swung the brand in a great slow arc, the flame hissing through the cold air, the sparks scattering. The bold one stopped. For a long moment, the woman and the wolf looked at one another across the firelight. 2 creatures, each trying to live through the same hard winter, each understanding the other in the wordless way the living understand the living. Then the wolf turned and melted back into the dark. The others followed. The eyes blinked out, one pair at a time, until there was nothing left but the night and the fire, and the great pounding of her own heart. She stood in the gap a long while after they were gone, and when at last she lay back down, she did not sleep. But she had learned something else about herself that night. When the dark came for her, she did not run from it. She stood up and she faced it down. She finished the door the very next day. It was a battle she did not intend to lose twice. She used the saw to cut down dead standing pine, limbing the trunks, cutting them to length. She framed the doorway, nailing the rough timbers to the rock where she could, wedging them tight into the stonework where she couldn't. She built the door itself from split planks, braced crosswise, and hung it on the heavy iron hinges that Amos Crane had pressed on her for nothing when it swung shut for the first time and she dropped the simple wooden latch into place. The sound of it was the most satisfying sound she had ever heard. A solid, final thunk. A door. Her door. A thing that closed and stayed closed and kept the dark on the other side of it. Over the window opening, she stretched the heavy canvas, treated and taut, so that it let in a soft, glowing light by day, but turned the wind aside. The cave was becoming a room. The room was becoming a home. Not every danger that came up the mountain walked on four legs. One gray afternoon, a man came up the trail. Not the foreman. Not anyone from the town. A stranger. Thin to the point of gauntness, his coat too light for the cold, his boots worn through. A drifter, the kind that moved through the high country in the hard seasons, looking for whatever could be found or taken. He had seen the smoke. He had followed it up. And when she came around the corner of the wall with an armload of wood, she found him standing at her door, his hand already on the latch, his eyes already on the sacks of flour stacked in the dim within. They both went still. She set the wood down, slowly. He was younger than the lines in his face, and he was desperate. She could see it in him the way she had learned to see weather in the sky, the hollow cheeks, the shaking hands, the eyes that could not quite meet hers, and could not quite leave the food. A frightened thing, a starving thing, and a dangerous one for exactly that reason. There was a long, taut silence between them. She could have screamed, though there was no one to hear. She could have reached for the axe. She could have done a great many things that lead to blood in the snow. She did none of them. "You're hungry," she said. It was not a question. It was the plainest fact in the world, written all over him. The man said nothing. His hand stayed on the latch, but something in his face shifted. "There's a stump there," she said, and nodded toward it. "Sit down before you fall down." She moved past him, slowly, openly, her hands where he could see them, and she went inside. And in a moment she came back out with a heel of bread and a wedge of the cheese and a tin cup of water from the spring. She held them out. The man stared at her hand as if it were a trick. "Take it," she said. "I didn't haul that flour 4 miles up a mountain to watch a man die at my door over a loaf of it." He took it. He ate the way a starving man eats, too fast, his hands shaking. And when it was gone, he sat there, staring at his empty palms, and his shoulders began to tremble in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. "I wasn't always," he started, and stopped. There's no work. Down below. The mine don't take new men this time of year. I haven't ate in. I know, she said gently. She did not need the rest of the story. She knew it already. It was the same story the company told about all of them. Useful or useless. A profit or a cost. And the moment you slipped from the one to the other, they let the winter have you. She knew exactly how that felt. She wrapped what bread she could spare in a cloth and a fistful of beans in another, and she pressed them into his hands. There's a town 2 valleys west, she said. Smaller. They winter their own. You won't be a stranger there the way you're a stranger here. He looked at her like she had handed him his own life back. Why, he said, you don't even... Why would you do this? And she thought about it. Honestly. Because he deserved an honest answer. Because somebody decided I wasn't worth keeping, she said at last. And they were wrong. And I'd be no better than them if I looked at you and decided the same. He left as the light was going. She watched him down the trail until he was gone. And she felt no fear at all. Only the strange, quiet certainty that she had done the one thing that kept her from becoming the very thing that had broken her. The kindness of one old man at a counter had reached her in the dark. Now it had passed through her and on to one more frozen soul on the mountain. That, she thought, was how a person survived a hard winter. Not just with stone and fire, but with that. At last came the day of the stove. The crane boy brought the wagon up the old logging trail, just as his father had promised. The heavy iron stove lashed in the back, rocking and groaning at every rut. The wheels could only go so far. Where the trail steepened past the Bearhead Rock, they stopped. The last half mile was hers. It was a battle of will and leverage and stubbornness against 300 pounds of cold black iron. They built a sledge of green pine branches. They wedged it. They levered it. They slid the stove a few feet at a time up the steep slope, resting between each push, the boy red-faced and amazed, the woman silent and relentless. I never seen anybody work like you, Mrs. Marin, the boy said at one point, leaning on his knees, gasping. You haven't seen many people with nowhere else to go, she said. And they bent their backs and pushed again. When it was done, when the stove sat at last on the leveled stone platform she had built for it inside the alcove, 5 feet back from the front wall, she paid the boy his $1, and she added a thick slice of bread and honey from her own small store, which was worth more to her just then than the coin. He ran the empty wagon back down the mountain, and she set to fitting the pipe. She ran it up from the stove and out through the channel she had left in her stone wall, sealing the gaps around it with mud and small stones, the way Ezra's journal had shown her. She angled it so the smoke would draw, and the natural crack in the back of the cave would help pull it. A chimney made half by man and half by mountain. When the last joint was seated and sealed, she stepped back and looked at it. A black iron heart set into a body of granite and pine, the center of her new world. The last task was the most important of all. It was not building. It was not a wall or a door or a stove. It was wood, and it was not a chore. It was her life itself, cut and split and stacked. She worked at it with a kind of fever. She sawed the fallen pine and aspen into stove lengths. She split the larger rounds with the back of the axe and a wooden wedge driven home blow by blow. And she hauled it all up to the shelter, armload after armload, until her arms had no feeling left in them. She stacked it along the inside wall, a dense, fragrant, growing wall of fuel. And she did not just pile it, she organized it, the way her careful mind organized everything. Kindling here, small splits there, the big, slow-burning rounds at the back, the driest wood where she could reach it first, the green wood set aside to season behind. She stacked it to the ceiling. She stacked it the full 12-foot depth of the cave. 4 cords of it, at the least. A fortress of firewood, a wall against the dark, warmth and cooked food, and life itself, measured out in split and seasoned lengths. When it was done, when the last log was wedged into place, and the wood pile ran from the floor to the stone above and filled the whole back of the cave, she stood at the door and looked at what she had made. The light came soft through the canvas window. The stove sat ready and black on its stone. The wall stood solid and gray across the mouth of the world. The wood waited, rank on rank. The spring trickled, clear and cold, just beyond the door. Stone and fire and water and wood. The 4 simple things. It had taken her 13 days. 13 days of torn hands and aching bones, of laughter drifting up from the town and warnings drifting up from the company, of a wall that fell and wolves at the door and a hungry stranger she had chosen not to fear. 13 days that had turned a cave into something else. She stepped inside, and she set her bandaged hand against the cool stone of the wall she had raised herself. It was no longer a cave. It was a home, a small, stone, stubborn fortress against everything the mountain meant to throw at it. And it was hers. No notice could take it. No company owned it. No number on a page could measure what she had built with her own 2 ruined hands. Outside, far above the highest peaks, the sky had begun to change. It had taken on a low, heavy, metal gray color that she had not seen before. The air had gone very still, and somewhere in the back of her mind, the part of her that had learned, these 13 days, to read the mountain the way her husband once had, something whispered a quiet warning. She looked up at that strange, waiting sky. She looked at her door, her stove, her wall, her wood. "Let it come," she said softly. "I'm ready." And she went inside and dropped the latch. The sky had been warning her all afternoon. That low, heavy, metal-colored light, that strange and total stillness, as if the whole mountain were holding its breath. And then, near dusk, it let that breath go. The storm did not arrive the way ordinary weather arrives. It did not drift in soft and gray. It came down off the high peaks like something alive, something vast and white and furious, pouring into the valley as if it meant to scrub the world clean of every living thing that dared to stay. The wind came first. It hit the great body of the ridge with a sound like the sea, a long, unbroken roar that did not rise and fall, but simply was, filling the whole world from edge to edge. Then the snow, not in flakes, in sheets, in a solid, blinding sideways wall of white that swallowed the trees, the slope, the sky, until there was nothing left to see at all. Within minutes, the world beyond her door simply vanished. But Maren was ready. She stood inside her small stone shelter, and she listened to the beast throw itself against the mountain. And she dropped the latch. That sound again. That solid, final thunk of seasoned wood against its frame. The sweetest sound she knew. And then a strange and wonderful thing happened. The great roar of the wind split. It struck the massive shoulder of the ridge above her, and it broke around it, the way a river breaks around a stone, and it poured past on either side and left her little south-facing alcove sitting in a pocket of sudden, eerie calm. Her wall, only 4 feet high but thick and true, turned aside the gusts that came swirling around the edges. The door held. The canvas window trembled but did not give. Inside, there was quiet. She lit a single candle. Its small flame stood straight up in the still air. It did not so much as flicker, and outside, a hand's width of stone away, the world was being torn to pieces. She knelt at the stove. A handful of dry pine shavings. A little pyramid of kindling lay just so, 2 small splits of seasoned aspen above it. The match flared on the first strike. The flame caught the shavings and licked up into the kindling and took hold of the aspen, and in a moment, the little iron heart of her home was glowing, and a deep, radiating warmth began to fill the space. She sat back on her bedroll, a thick mattress of pine boughs laid beneath a gray wool blanket, and she watched the stove begin to glow, a faint red at first, then deeper. She held her ruined hands out toward it, and for the first time in many long days, they stopped aching. The beast raged on through the night, and it did not stop with the morning. It raged the next day, and the next. The cold pressed down harder and harder, until it was a living thing in its own right, a presence that pushed against her little shelter from every side, looking for the smallest crack, the smallest gap, the smallest mistake. It found none. The snow rose. By the second day, it had climbed past her canvas window, turning the soft glowing light to a dim blue twilight. By the third, it had reached the top of her wall, and then it buried her door entirely. A lesser woman might have felt the panic rise then. Entombed, sealed in, buried alive in a cave on a mountain in the heart of a storm, with no one in the world who knew or cared whether she lived or died. But Marin did not panic, because she had read his journal so many times that she knew its pages by heart. And she understood a thing that the frightened people down below did not. The snow was not her enemy. The snow was her ally. She had read it in one of Ezra's books, in his own underlined hand, that a thick blanket of snow holds the warmth in the way a wall of packed straw does, that it does not steal heat, it keeps it. The deep drift that had buried her door was wrapping her whole shelter in a soft white blanket, sealing her in with her own warmth. The heat from her little stove, which the bitter air outside would have stolen away in an instant, was held now, held by the snow, held by the thick stone walls, held by the great body of limestone all around her, which drank the warmth all day and gave it slowly back all night. She was not entombed. She was cradled. She settled into a rhythm, the slow, patient rhythm of a person who means to outlast a thing rather than fight it. Each morning she fed the stove, just enough. A low, steady fire, no more. She had a small thermometer that had been Ezra's, and she watched it the way a captain watches the sea. She kept the air inside at a steady warmth, comfortable but never wasteful. Any warmer, she knew, would only burn her precious wood faster, and the wood was everything. She kept her accounts. In the margins of his journal, in the blank spaces between his careful drawings, she wrote her own numbers now. How many splits to hold the warmth through a day? How many through a night? How long, at this rate, her 4 cords would last? She counted her firewood the way another person might count a heartbeat, because that, in truth, was what it was. And her figures told her she would make it, not just survive, live. Warm and dry and fed, while a storm such as the mountain had not shown in a long, long time tried to tear the whole world apart, one cold inch at a time. When the snow sealed her door, she did not despair. She took her shovel, and she dug. She carved a narrow tunnel out through the drift, low and tight, 10 feet of it, ending in a shaft that rose to the surface like a chimney into the open air. And that tunnel, she found, did not weaken her shelter. It strengthened it. The packed snow around the passage held even more warmth in. Her new little doorway through the drift became one more wall against the cold. She would climb out through it once a day, into the blinding white, just to be sure the shaft stayed open, just to look at the storm and let it look at her, and know that it had not beaten her. Then she would climb back down into the warm. The thing her husband had imagined, sketched out in a journal he would never see used, had become real around her. It worked. Every principle, every careful line, it all held. On one of those buried days, she wrote 3 words in the margin of his book, next to her columns of firewood figures. It holds. M. And she ran her fingers over the words, and she felt, very near, the quiet presence of the man who had given her the means to write them. Far below, the town was learning a different lesson. While the widow on the ridge sat warm in her fortress of stone, the town the company had built was failing. The houses were thrown together quickly and cheaply, the way the company did everything, built for speed and not for the mountain. The walls were thin. The cracks were many. The wind that had broken so gently around Marin's Ridge came down into the valley with nothing to stop it, and it found every gap in every wall, and it poured the cold straight through. The houses did not hold the warmth. They lost it, as fast as the stoves could make it, and then, one by one, the families began to run low on wood. They had not stacked 4 cords against the back of a cave. They had not split and seasoned and saved. They had bought a little here and a little there, the way people do who trust that tomorrow will be much like today. The storm taught them otherwise. Their wood piles, what there was of them, lay frozen solid under the drifts, the green wood hissing and steaming and refusing to burn. The cold crept into the houses, and then it crept into the people. There was coughing in the night, fevers rising in the small bodies of children, the thin, dry, rattling sound of lungs that could not get warm. And the company had not prepared. The man whose job it was to run the place, a man named Conrad Voss, sat out the storm in his own house behind the office, which was the one building in the whole town that had been built properly, with thick walls and a good stove and wood enough to spare. He kept warm. He kept the door shut. And when the desperate ones came to it, knocking, asking what was to be done, he told them, through the wood, to wait, to make do, to stay strong until the storm passed and the company could see what might be arranged. He did not open the door. He had decided long ago what these people were worth, a cost to be managed at the smallest possible expense. And in the middle of a storm, the smallest possible expense was to do nothing at all. And so he sat in his warm room with the wind howling at the eaves, and he let the winter do as it would with the people outside. But while Conrad Voss kept his door shut, word had begun to move through the freezing town. It moved the way warmth moves, slowly, from hand to hand, from mouth to ear. The widow, the mad widow on the ridge. They say she's alive up there. They say she's warm. At first, no one believed it. How could she be? A woman alone in a cave on the highest, coldest, most exposed shoulder of the whole mountain, while families froze in proper houses down in the sheltered valley. It made no sense. It made no sense at all until an old man decided to find out for himself. The storm broke at last. It did not fade. It simply stopped. The way such things do, all at once, leaving behind a silence so deep it rang in the ears. And when it lifted, the world had been made over entirely in white. The snow lay deep on the level ground, sculpted by the wind into great smooth waves and ridges. The pines bowed under the weight of it. The sky overhead was a hard, brilliant, aching blue, and the cold beneath that blue was the still and savage cold that comes after a storm has spent itself. It was into that white silence that Amos Crane came climbing. The old man had not slept, worrying about her, and the moment the wind died, he had strapped on a pair of old wooden snowshoes that had hung on the wall of his store for 30 years, and he had set out up the buried trail. It was a hard climb for a man of 70 with knotted hands. He fell. He rose. He fell again. The cold burned in his old lungs. But he had to know. He had been the only one to witness her impossible plan. And he could not bear to think he had watched a good woman walk off to her death and said nothing and done nothing but hand her a blanket and a box of nails. He followed the faint trace of smoke. It was the only thing breaking the white, a thin, steady, orderly thread of it, rising from the great pale cliff far above. A steady thread, not the choked, smoking, struggling smoke of the dying fires down in the town. A clean, confident, well-drawn thread of smoke, and the sight of it gave the old man the strength for the last hard climb. He found the shaft of her snow tunnel. He called down it, and after a moment, her voice came back up, steady and alive. He climbed down through the drift, through the low, tight passage, fumbling in the dim. And then she opened the inner door for him, and Amos Crane stopped, one boot still in the snow tunnel, and simply stared. The air that rolled out to meet him was warm and dry, and full of the smell of wood smoke and coffee. He looked at the dry stacked granite wall, every stone set true. He looked at the well-hung door, the taut, glowing window, the black stove ticking with heat on its bed of stone. He looked at the enormous, orderly woodpile that ran the full depth of the cave, floor to ceiling. He looked at all of it, and then he looked at her. "My God, Marin," he said, very quietly. His old voice shook, and it was not from the cold. "You're warmer up here than I am in my own house behind the store." She helped him to a seat by the stove and pressed a cup of hot coffee into his stiff old hands. He wrapped them around it and closed his eyes. He had brought a few small things in a sack over his shoulder. A little bag of sugar, a tin of tea, 2 books from a shipment that had come in just before the storm. "A little something," he said gruffly, almost embarrassed, "to pass the long days." She took them as gently as he had once given her the blanket and the nails. And then he told her the news from below. And the news was grim. The houses had failed. Families had burned through their wood. There was sickness everywhere. Coughing, fever, the dry rattle in too many small chests. The company had done nothing. The man who ran it sat warm behind a shut door, and the people had been left to face the cold alone. Maren listened. She did not gloat. There was no triumph in her face. She only listened. And as she listened, her jaw set, and a different kind of fire came up behind her eyes. Because she knew exactly what it was to be left out in the cold. She knew exactly what it was to be turned away, counted as nothing, a thing not worth the trouble of saving. And she had decided that night in the dark kitchen that she would not become the men who had done that to her. "Amos," she said, "when you go back down." She was already reaching for kindling, already pulling split pine from her precious pile. "You tell them something for me." The first to come was a young mother. Her name was Della. She came 2 days after the old man's visit, dragging a small sled up the buried trail by a rope across her shoulder, sinking to her knees in the snow with every step. On the sled, bundled in every blanket she owned, lay her small son. The boy was perhaps 4 years old, and he was very sick. Maren heard the crying before she saw them, the thin, frightened crying of a mother near the end of her strength. And she came up out of her tunnel into the cold and saw the small dark shape struggling up the white slope below. She did not wait. She went down to them, sinking in the snow. And she took the rope from Della's shoulder and pulled the sled the rest of the way herself. She brought them both inside, into the warm. She lifted the boy from the sled. He was burning with fever, and yet shivering, his small body caught in that terrible place between fire and ice. His breath came in a dry, rattling cough that frightened her more than the wolves had. She laid him close to the stove. She wrapped him in her own gray wool blanket, the one Amos Crane had given her, and she warmed water at the stove and steeped it with a little of the dried mint she had gathered in the autumn and a spoonful of the old man's sugar. She held the cup to the child's lips. "There now," she murmured. "There now, little one. You're warm. You're safe. The cold can't reach you here." And Della, who had not slept in days, who had watched her boy fade in a freezing house while the company kept its door shut, Della sank down by the stove and wept. She wept the way a person weeps when, after holding too much for too long, they are finally allowed to set it down. Maren let her weep. She knew that kind of crying too. The boy slept, and as the long hours passed, the fever broke. The terrible rattle in his small chest began to ease. By the deep of the night, he was breathing soft and slow, his cheek pink with warmth instead of fever. One small fist curled against the gray wool, and his mother sat watching him, hardly daring to believe it. "How?" Della whispered at last. "How are you warm up here, when we're freezing down there in real houses?" And Maren did not keep it to herself. She did not hoard it the way the company hoarded everything. She took the young woman to the door and she pointed out at the great drift of snow piled high against the side of the ridge. "The snow," she said. "You think it's your enemy. It isn't. It's the warmest blanket the mountains got, if you know how to use it." And she showed her. She explained how to bank the deep snow up against the north and west walls of a house, to pack it down, to build a thick white wall of it so the wind could not reach the wood and the warmth could not escape into the cold. She explained how to clear the worst of it off a roof so the weight would not bring it down, how to stack a wood pile so the driest wood waited at hand and the wet wood seasoned behind, how to start a dead fire from a single ember and never, ever let it go out. She drew it in the dust of the floor with her finger, the way Ezra had once drawn for her. And when, at last, the trail was passable again, she sent Della back down the mountain, not empty-handed, with a bundle of dry kindling, a small sack of split, seasoned pine, and the boy, well and warm and sleeping, lashed snug to the sled. "This will get your fire going again," Marin told her. "And then you keep it going, no matter what. You hear me? No matter what." Della looked at her, this woman the whole town had called mad, and her eyes were full. "They were wrong about you," she said. "All of them. They were so wrong." Marin only pressed the kindling into her arms. "Go," she said softly. "Go on home to your house, and keep your boy warm." And the young mother went, carrying down the mountain not just fire, but knowledge, not just kindling, but a thing the company had never once offered any of them: hope. After Della, others came. The trail had been broken now, and word had spread, and the steady thread of smoke above the cliff had become a kind of beacon to a freezing town. They came one at a time, and then 2 and 3 together. An old widower whose hands had gone too stiff and crooked to split his own frozen wood. A young couple with a new baby, terrified of the cold that crept toward the cradle. A miner's family with no wood left at all, and 3 children coughing in the dark. They climbed the mountain to the mad widow's door, and they did not come for charity. That was the thing she came to understand. As the days passed and the small line of desperate people kept appearing out of the white, they were proud people, hard people, people who had been taught all their lives that asking for help was a kind of failing. They did not come to beg. They came to learn, and she taught them. She taught them all of it, everything Ezra's journal had given her, and everything the mountain had taught her since. She drew her diagrams in the snow with a stick. She showed them how to build a snow wall as a windbreak, how to clear a roof before it collapsed, how to dry green wood and bank a fire and keep a small house warm with half the fuel they had been wasting. She gave away what she could spare of her own wood and her own food, small amounts, carefully measured, for she still had her own long winter to outlast. But the wood and the food were never the real gift. The real gift was the knowing. The woman who had been cast out as a useless burden, the widow they had measured at $75 and sent up the mountain to die, had become the single most valuable person on the whole mountain. She was no longer the mad widow. She was no longer Ezra's widow, even, a woman defined by the man she had lost. They began to call her something new, the woman on the ridge, the one who understands the cold, and down in the valley, in his warm shut room, behind his thick walls and his good stove. Conrad Voss began to hear that name too, He heard it from his foreman. He heard it from the men. He heard it whispered in a tone he did not like at all. A tone of something close to wonder, close to respect. The widow he had cleared from his books with a stroke of a pen. The cost he had thought would solve itself. She had not frozen. She had not quit. She had not crawled back down the mountain, humbled and begging. She had done the one thing he had never imagined a discarded line item could do. She had become the answer to the very disaster his neglect had made. He stood at his window, looking up at that thin, steady thread of smoke rising from the high, pale cliff, clean and confident against the brilliant blue. And for the first time, Conrad Voss felt something cold move through him that had nothing to do with the winter. He had decided what she was worth, and he was beginning to understand that he had been wrong. High on the ridge, Maren stood at her door in the brilliant after-storm light. Behind her, the stove glowed warm, and a child she had saved slept safe in a house down in the valley, and a town that had laughed at her was learning, one frozen family at a time, to call her by a new name. She looked out over the white world spread far below her. She thought of Ezra, of his careful hands and his quiet voice, and the journal that had reached across the dark to save her. "You see them?" she whispered to the cold blue air. "They're listening now. They're finally listening." And no voice answered her across the snow. There was only the wind and the wide white silence. And yet, standing there, she did not feel that she was speaking to no one at all. The cold had come for her. The cruelty had come for her. And she had met them both and turned them, somehow, into warmth for other people's children. The worst was over now. But the reckoning was only just beginning. For high in an office in a city she would never see, men were already asking how a whole town had nearly frozen in houses they had built. And the answer to that question, every part of it, was waiting for them at the top of a mountain, in a fortress of stone, built by the hands of a woman they had thrown away. But warmth, once it begins to spread, does not ask permission, and the story of the woman on the ridge had already begun to travel further than she knew. Word of a thing like that does not stay on a mountain. It travels. It went down the broken trail in the mouths of grateful people, and through the valley, and along the wires and the roads, all the way to a city far away, where the men who owned the mine kept their offices and their careful idea of how the world was supposed to work. And in that city, the news landed badly. A whole town, nearly frozen, in houses the company itself had built. It was the kind of failure that costs money, and the men in the city understood very little of mountains, but they understood money perfectly. So they sent their best man to find out what had gone wrong. His name was Edmund Whitlock. He was a man near the back half of his life, lean and gray and serious, with the patient, measuring eyes of someone who has spent his years learning exactly how things are built and exactly why they fall down. He had studied at fine schools. He had raised structures that still stood. He believed, the way such men believe, in proof, in what could be measured and tested and shown. He did not believe in stories. And when he arrived in the high town and began his work, what he found did not impress him. He walked the rows of company houses, and he saw at once what was wrong with them. Thin walls, poor joints, Stoves badly placed and worse vented. Houses thrown up fast and cheap by men who had never spent a single hard winter at that altitude and never meant to. This whole settlement, he said at last, to no one in particular, is built wrong, top to bottom. It was never going to hold. He was a fair man in his cold way, but he had no idea yet what he was about to learn. It was the old storekeeper who told him. Amos Crane stood behind his counter, and he listened to the gray engineer talk about thermal loss and structural failure, and all the fine words for the houses didn't keep people warm, and at last the old man could hold his tongue no longer. "You want to know how to build for this mountain?" Amos said. "There's only one person up here ever did it right." Whitlock looked up from his notes. "And who would that be?" "A woman," said the old man, "up on the ridge, built herself a place out of stone and rode out the whole storm in it, warmer than any house in this valley." He paused. "Warmer than mine." The engineer's face did not change, but something behind his eyes went carefully blank. The particular blankness of an educated man trying to be polite about a thing he does not believe for one moment. A woman, alone, in a cave, warmer than the houses he had spent his career learning to build. "I'm sure she was fortunate," he said. "It wasn't luck," said Amos Crane. "You go up and see, then tell me it was luck." And there was something in the old man's flat certainty that the engineer could not quite dismiss. His curiosity, the same curiosity that had made him good at his work, would not let it go. So the next morning, with the old storekeeper to guide him, Edmund Whitlock climbed the mountain. He expected a hovel. He expected to find some crude, smoke-blackened hole where a desperate woman had huddled and, by sheer dumb luck, not died. He was already composing the gentle, condescending words he would use. "A remarkable show of courage, ma'am. You were very lucky." He climbed the long trail in the thin, cold air, breathing hard, the old man surprisingly sure-footed ahead of him. And as they came up over the last rise, he saw the smoke. He stopped. He had spent the better part of a week looking at the smoke of that valley. Choked smoke, struggling smoke, the gray, laboring smoke of badly built fires in badly built houses. This was not that. This was a thin, clean, perfectly steady thread, rising straight and confident from the high, pale cliff into the still blue air. A man who has studied fire and air his whole life knows what that means. It means a draft that draws properly, a stove that breathes, a chimney built right. Edmund Whitlock looked at that thread of smoke, and for the first time, the polite, condescending words died in his mouth. He climbed the rest of the way in silence, and then a woman opened a well-hung wooden door in a wall of fitted stone and looked at him with steady, unafraid eyes and said, "You'll be the man from the city. You'd better come in out of the cold." He stepped through the door, and the breath went out of him. The air inside was warm, not barely warm, not the desperate, struggling warmth of a fire losing its fight against the cold. Warm, dry, steady, comfortable. The kind of warmth he had failed to achieve in houses with 4 proper walls and a roof. He stood just inside the door, and he forgot entirely the speech he had prepared. He began instead to look. He looked the way he had been trained to look, and everything his eyes touched They understood. He ran his hand along the dry, stacked granite wall, feeling the tight fit of the stones, the way the small, chinking stones wedged the larger ones into a single solid mass. No mortar, he murmured, and it's airtight. How? He didn't finish. He had already seen how. The overlap joints. The careful fit. He had seen the same technique in old structures that had stood for centuries, and he had never once seen it done by a hand that hadn't been taught by another mason. He moved to the stove. He studied the way the pipe was run, sealed, vented up through the wall, and drawn along by the natural crack in the rock above. "That's your chimney," he said slowly, pointing up at the fissure. "You've used the fault in the stone. It pulls the smoke without pulling your heat with it." He shook his head. "That's why your draft is clean. That's the smoke I saw." He turned in a slow circle, taking in the whole of it, the southern-facing mouth, the great mass of limestone overhead, the orderly mountain of seasoned wood, and he began, almost without meaning to speak in the language of his profession, half to her, half to himself. "This isn't a cave," he said quietly. "This is a passive solar dwelling. The whole front opens to the south. You collect the sun all day. Every day there's sun to be had." He laid his hand flat against the limestone wall. "And the rock. You've used the rock itself. It drinks the heat in the daytime and gives it back all through the night. That's the thermal mass. That's why one small stove can hold you steady when my houses with proper stoves are freezing." He looked at her, and there was something almost like alarm in his face. "That's why you didn't die." Marin said nothing. She let him work it out, the way she had once worked it out herself, by candlelight, with a dead man's journal in her lap. Edmund Whitlock turned to her at last, and every trace of the condescension he had carried up the mountain was gone from his face. What had replaced it was something he did not give easily, and had not given in years: respect. "Madam," he said, "where did you learn to do this?" And Marin looked at him for a long moment. Then she crossed to the small shelf by her bedroll, and she lifted down a journal, bound in dark brown leather, its corners worn smooth. She held it, but she did not hand it to him. "My husband," she said, "taught me to watch how the world holds itself together." Her voice was steady, but the engineer, who was a careful watcher of things, saw the way her hand tightened on the worn leather. He studied these mountains, the stone, the water, the way the heat moves and where it goes. He wrote it all down. He found this place, and he saw what it could be, and he wrote that down too. She looked up. He died before he could ever use it. And then the men he died for handed me a notice and a number, and told me I had 14 days to be gone. The engineer was very still. "So I took what he left me," she said, "and I built it. The rest." She set the journal gently back on the shelf. "The rest is just paying attention and refusing to quit." Edmund Whitlock was quiet for a long time. He was a man who had spent his whole life among blueprints and calculations and the certainty of educated men. And he understood, standing in that warm stone room, that he had just been handed a lesson that none of his fine schools had ever taught him. "This is more than paying attention," he said at last. His voice had gone rough. "This is the answer to the very problem I was sent here to solve." He gestured at the walls, the stove, the great body of the mountain holding the warmth. The company means to build new houses, houses that can survive these winters. And the truth is, we don't know how. We build what works down in the city, and it fails up here. It fails every time. He looked at her squarely. What you've built here, this is the blueprint. The principles you've used are the solution. We need what you know. He drew a breath and made the offer that the men in the city had sent him to make to whoever could save them. He had never imagined it would be a widow in a cave. The company would like to hire you, he said, to help design the new town. They'll pay you for it, properly. The silence that followed was a long one, and the irony of it filled the whole warm room. The company that had measured her at $75 and sent her up a mountain to die was now standing at her door, hat in hand, asking to buy back the very wisdom it had thrown away. Marin looked at the gray engineer for a long moment, and then she looked past him, out the open door, down the long white slope, to the valley far below, where a thin trail of small dark figures had been climbing to her door for days now, not for charity, but for the knowing she carried, where a young mother named Della had wept by her stove, where a small boy who should have died of the cold was, even now, warm and breathing and alive. I'll do it, she said. The engineer let out a breath he had not known he was holding. But understand me, Marin said, and her voice went hard and clear. I'm not doing it for the company. The company can freeze in its own books, for all I care. She stepped to the door, and she looked down at the valley. I'm doing it for them. For the woman who dragged her sick child up a mountain because there was nowhere warm left in the whole town. For every family that nearly died in a house your company built. She turned back to him. Those people are going to have warm homes, real ones. Because if I'd had a warm home to begin with, none of this would have had to happen at all. Edmund Whitlock looked at her, and he nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he has just understood that he is in the presence of someone better than himself. Then we'd best get to work, he said. The reckoning came for Conrad Voss the way reckonings usually come, not all at once, but slowly, and then completely. The engineer's report went down to the city, and it did not spare him. It laid out, in plain cold numbers, exactly how a town had nearly frozen because the man who ran it had built cheap, prepared nothing, and shut his door on his own people when the storm came. The men in the city did not care about cruelty. They never had. But they cared a great deal that a discarded widow had done, for nothing, what their well-paid superintendent had failed to do at all. It made him look like exactly what he was. And so, quietly, the word came up from the city. Conrad Voss was finished. But the strange part, the part no one expected, was what Voss did before he left. On a clear, cold morning near the end of the winter, a figure came climbing slowly up the trail to the ridge. Marin saw him from a long way off. She did not at first know who it was, only that he climbed badly, like a man unused to the mountain, and that he climbed anyway, all the way to the top. And then she saw his face, the man who ran the mine, the man who had signed her notice without ever once seeing her, the man who had sat behind a shut door while children coughed in the cold. Conrad Voss. He stopped a few feet from her door. He was breathing hard. He looked older than she had imagined, smaller. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "They've let me go," he said at last. There was no anger in it, only a flat, tired honesty. "I expect you've heard." "I heard," she said. He looked past her, at the wall, the door, the thin, steady smoke. "I came up here," he said slowly, "because I wanted to see it. The thing they're all talking about. The thing that—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "The thing that proved me wrong." He looked at her then, truly looked at her. The first time he ever had. "I never opened my door," he said. "During the storm, they came knocking, and I sat there, and I told myself there was nothing to be done, that it wasn't my place to—" He shook his head. "I had wood enough to share. I had room. And I told myself they were a problem, to be managed." The words seemed to cost him something. "You were a name I signed off without a second thought," he said. "And while I was doing that, you were up here building the only thing in this whole valley that worked." Marin said nothing. She had imagined on the worst nights what she might say to this man if she ever stood face to face with him. She had imagined the things she might throw at him, the bitterness she had earned the right to feel. But standing here now, looking at this small, tired, broken man who had finally climbed the mountain to see what he had thrown away, she found she did not want any of it, because bitterness, she had learned, was just another kind of cold. And she had spent a whole winter learning how to keep the cold out. "Come in," she said, "out of the wind." Voss stared at her. "After what You climbed all this way," she said. "You'll not climb back down frozen on my account. Come in, there's coffee." And she stepped aside and held her own door open, for the man who had never opened his. He sat by her stove, this fallen man, and he warmed his hands, and for a while he said nothing at all. And when he finally spoke, his voice was different. "How do you do it?" he asked. "How do you look at me and not hate me?" Marin was quiet for a moment. "Because somebody decided I was worthless," she said, "and it nearly killed me. Not the cold, the deciding." She poured him more coffee. "I'll not do that to another living soul. Not even you. Especially not you." She looked at him. "You did a cold thing, Mr. Voss. The worst thing. But you climbed a mountain to say so to my face. That's more than most men would do." She paused. "A man who can see he was wrong isn't worthless. He's just got work to do. Same as everyone." Conrad Voss looked into his coffee for a long, long time. And when he left, near the end of the day, he stopped at the door and he turned back. "The new town they're building," he said. "The one with your designs. I won't be running it. But before I go, I'm going to tell them, every man of them, exactly whose work it is, by name, so no one ever forgets." He swallowed. "It's the only thing I've got left to give you, but you'll have it." And he meant it. He went down the mountain a different man than he had climbed it. It was not a grand redemption. The world does not work that way. But it was a beginning, a door, opened at last. And Marin had learned that winter that an open door can change everything. The work began in earnest as the deep snows started to soften, not in some city office, at the old storekeeper's table in the warm back room behind the counter, with coffee going cold and rough paper covered in pencil. Marin drew. She had never drawn a building in her life, but she could draw what she knew, and what she knew, the engineer could read. Every house, she said, must open to the south. Big windows on that side to drink the winter sun. The north walls thick and blind, banked with earth against the cold. Stone at the heart of every home. A hearth. A mass to hold the warmth and give it slowly back through the long nights. Smaller stoves, better vented. No more of the greedy, leaking, badly drawn things that had failed the whole valley. And wood. A plan for the wood, so that every family had a store of dry, seasoned fuel laid up long before the first storm, and a place to keep it dry, and the knowing of how to use it. Edmund Whitlock took her rough pencil lines and turned them into proper plans, and the more he worked beside her, the more astonished he became. Not at her any more, for he had stopped being surprised by her, but at the things his own fine education had never taught him. "You understand the movement of heat," he told her once, "better than men I studied with for years. You feel it." "Where did that come from?" "From a cold house," she said simply, "and a man who paid attention, and one very long winter that didn't leave me much choice." He laughed at that, the first time she had heard him laugh, and she found she did not mind the sound of it. A thing grew between them, over those weeks at the storekeeper's table. Not a fast thing, not a loud thing. There was too much winter behind her, and too much grief, for anything fast or loud. But a quiet respect, an ease, the companionship of two people who looked at the world the same way, who could sit in a long silence over a half-drawn plan and not need to fill it. He began to find reasons to climb the ridge, to check a measurement, he would say, to ask about a detail. She let him. It was not the great love of her life. The great love of her life was in the cold ground of the valley, and would always be, and she would not pretend otherwise. But the heart, she was learning, is not a ledger with a single line. There is room in it, room for what was lost, and room, still, for the small new warmth of a friend who climbs a mountain just to sit beside you in the quiet. She did not name it. She did not rush it. She simply let it be one more warm thing in a life that had been so very cold. When the work was done, the company paid her a sum that was to her a fortune, more money than she had ever held in her life, and she knew exactly what to do with it. She walked into the company's land office with the gray engineer beside her as her witness, and she bought the deed to 10 acres on the south slope of the mountain. The plot that held her limestone alcove, the ridge that a dead man had named in a journal before he ever knew his widow would need it. It was hers now, by law, as well as by labor, by the paper in the office, as well as by the blood she had left on every stone of that wall. No notice could ever take it again. No company owned it. No number on a page could ever measure it. She kept some of the money back, too, enough to buy a small sound house in the town, a place for the warmer months, a foothold back among the living in the very community that had once laughed her up the mountain. But the ridge would always be hers, and the ridge, she decided, would never be only hers. The spring came slowly, the way spring comes to high places, reluctantly, and then all at once. The snow drew back up the mountain, retreating to the highest peaks. The valley turned green with new aspen leaves. The little spring by her door ran full and cold and clear, and the new town rose. Not the cheap, leaning, freezing thing the company had thrown up before. Real houses now. Houses that faced the sun. Houses with stone at their hearts, and thick walls at their backs, and dry wood stacked and waiting long before the cold could come. Maren walked through it one bright morning, and everywhere she went, people stopped to greet her. Not the mad widow anymore. Not even the woman who understands the cold. Just Maren. A neighbor. A friend. The old widower whose hands she had taught to bank a fire called out to her from his warm new doorway. The young couple with the baby waved from their south-facing window, and Della came running down the lane with her small son at her heels. A boy with pink cheeks and strong lungs, and not a trace left of the dry, terrible cough that had nearly taken him. The boy ran straight to Maren and wrapped his arms around her legs, and Della stood there, with her hand pressed to her mouth, the way she had stood that night by the stove. "He asks about you," Della said softly. "Every day. He wants to know when he can see the lady who made him warm." Maren knelt down. She looked into the small face that the winter had so nearly stolen, and something in her chest, some hard, cold knot that had been there since the morning the rock took her husband, came quietly undone. She had spent that whole long winter learning how to keep warmth in. She had not known until this moment that the warmth would come back to her, that a child's arms around her legs could thaw a thing in her that grief had frozen solid. "You can see her any time you like," she told the boy. "She's not going anywhere." She did not abandon the ridge. She never would, but she did not keep it as a lonely monument to her suffering either. She made it something else. When the hard times came, and in those high mountains, the hard times always came. The ridge was where people climbed, not to beg, to learn. She taught them, up there in the warm stone room, the things her husband's journal had taught her, and the things the long winter had taught her after that. How to read the sky, how to use the snow, how to keep a small fire holding through a long dark night, how to build so the mountain worked for you instead of against you. The knowledge did not die with her, the way it had so nearly died with Ezra. It spread. It passed from her hands to other hands, and from those to others still, the way warmth passes through a well-built house, slowly, evenly, reaching every cold corner. And that, she came to understand, was the true inheritance. Not the money, not even the land, the knowing. A thing no company could clear away. A thing no notice could ever take. A thing that, once given away, only grew. On a soft spring evening, near the end of it all, she stood at the mouth of her shelter, and she looked out over the valley. The new town glowed below her in the last of the light. Warm windows, steady smoke, rising clean and even from 100 well-built chimneys. The sound of children, faint and far, carried up on the evening air. Behind her, the stove sat clean and cool and ready. A neat stack of kindling waited beside it. The wall stood as solid as the day she had raised it. She thought of the woman who had sat in a dark kitchen once with a notice in her apron pocket and $117 to her name, and no way forward that she could see. That woman had believed she was alone, discarded, worth a number and a small one. That woman had been wrong. Marin laid her hand against the cool stone of the wall she had built with her own 2 hands, and she did not feel the old grief rise up to take her. She felt instead something she had almost forgotten the shape of: peace. The man she had loved was gone, and he would always be gone. That was a true thing, and she did not lie to herself about it. But he was not lost. He was in every warm house in that valley. He was in the careful slope of every south-facing wall. He was in the breath of a small boy who had lived through a winter that should have taken him. He had reached across the dark and handed her a key, and she had used it, not just to save herself, but to save them all. "You see, Ezra," she whispered to the soft spring air, "it wasn't for nothing. None of it was for nothing." And down below, in a valley full of warm and living homes, a window glowed, and somewhere a door opened. And the sound of it drifted all the way up to the woman on the ridge. She was no longer a widow defined by what she had lost. She was Marin of the Ridge, defined now and forever by what she had built and by what she had given away. She stood there a while longer in the gentle dark as the first stars came out over the peaks, and then she went inside to the warm, and she left the door open behind her.